Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see such a full room. I'm Lynette Clementson. I'm the director of the Wallace House Center for Journalists, and I'm joined here by my colleague. You can
Kate Cagney.
We're a nice team. And we are pleased to join you here for a discussion on disappearing federal data. We ended up on today's date because it was hard to find a date to get all of our people together. But when we landed on this date, it turned out to be important because, as you may have heard, today is the 100th day of the new administration that is governing our existence right now. And so it's a really important day to be having a conversation like this. And we're happy to have you all here because I think people don't necessarily know in a university as large as this one that we do a lot of interdisciplinary work together. And Wallace House is particularly proud and pleased to be collaborating with ISR. And the things that affect social science researchers affect journalists, and especially in an environment like this one. The questions that you all have are the questions that we all have as journalists, and we're happy to be looking at this today. So today's panel brings together our two disciplines, and I'll hand this over to you.
Great. As Lynette has just pointed out, I'm thrilled to see this packed room. And I also wanted to share that I think we have over 70 people on Zoom joining us as well. So I think those data suggest, right, engagement and demand to discuss this topic today. So as Lynette noted, as social scientists and journalists, we really recognize the invaluable role of federal data in our work. And some colleagues and I, we've been spending some time on the Hill in the last few weeks, 2 different sets of visits. And this is one of the things in which we have been fully engaged, why federal data matter, why we need to protect federal data, how they help us really think through crucial policy analyses and shape public understanding. So in this moment, I very much want to extend our gratitude to Jim and Wendy House. Jim and Wendy, could you give a wave? Thank you. For their generous support, making this important conversation possible. And their dedication, and really they are the inspiration for this event, and in thinking about the link between Wallace House and ISR to bridge the social sciences and journalism, and really to pave the way for a more informed and engaged society. And that's one of the things we hope will emerge from today. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Libby Hemphill. Libby, thank you. Libby is an associate research professor at ICPSR and an associate professor at the School of Information. Her expertise in artificial intelligence and data archives focuses on how AI can enhance data discovery and reuse. She also really is, I would say, expert in also engaging in social networks, making sure she brings her colleagues together. And she did so and was instrumental in launching ICPSR's effort to secure at-risk federal data over one long weekend and in many days post that crucial moment. And she continues to lead these initiatives to document and preserve this valuable information. So we are thankful to her. And with that, I'm going to hand things over so that she will introduce her colleagues.
Great. Thank you.
Anything else?
No, thank you. We'll, I guess, hand this back to you.
I think
We're good, Kyle.
Oh,
okay.
to Libby, maybe to Libby.
I have one.
I think I give it to Phoenix.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I'm sad that we have to, but I'm excited that we are. So our panelists today, we'll start over here with Catherine Morse, who has worked in libraries for 24 years and currently serves as the U.S. Government Law and Political Science Librarian and Collection Coordinator for the Clark Library for MAPS Government Information and Data Services. She's also a member of the library's web archiving team, having curated 2 archive web collections, one on water politics in Michigan and another on state policies on book challenges in schools and libraries. Thank you, Catherine. Next up is Josh Pasek, who's a professor of communication and media and political science, faculty associate at CPS, the Center for Political Studies here at ISR, and core faculty in the Michigan Institute for Data and AI in Society at U of M. His research explores issues in the measurement of political opinion and how new media and psychological processes shape political attitudes, public opinion, and political behaviors. He maintains our packages ANES, Rake, and Weights, and is co-author of the books Words That Matter and Democracy Amid Crises. Thanks for being here, Josh. Laura Santhanam is a health reporter and coordinating producer for polling at the PBS NewsHour, based in DC, and a current Knight Wallace Fellow here at U of M. An award-winning journalist from Tupelo, Mississippi, much of her coverage has routinely relied on data analysis and focused on the pandemic, the overdose crisis, Medicaid expansion, and why and where health disparities persist, and how to make healthcare more affordable and accessible. Thanks, Laura. And last but not least, Justin Schell, the Director of Digital Scholarship and Creative Spaces at the University of Michigan Library, where his portfolio includes the Shapiro Design Lab, Accessibility, Digital Scholarship, and the Computer and Video Game Archive. He's a veteran of data preservation efforts dating back to late 2016, when he helped organize a variety of data rescue activities across the country with, among others, the Environmental Data Government Initiative. So thank you, Justin. We're going to start with just a sort of make sure we're all on the same page. I'm going to ask each panelist to answer this first question, and then we'll dig a little deeper from there. Catherine will start us off. When we say federal data, what are we talking about?
Well, I would, you can hear me okay? Oh, okay. I would define it very broadly. So to include numeric data, scientific data, but really anything created at taxpayer expense, anything that is recorded. So that I would define it very broadly to include, websites. I would want to even include presidential communications that happen on social media, all sorts of things. Yeah.
Thank you. Josh.
Yeah, I think I also would echo this sort of federal data is a lot of different things, view of what we're talking about here, right? So it's easy to start by thinking about sort of particular data sets that are collected, curated, and otherwise managed by the federal government that have potentially incredible importance to the world, right? We can think of things ranging from, the information that NOAA has historically compiled on weather globally, to a whole bunch of different social data sets, many of which form the backbone of sort of our ability to understand society. And we can talk about sort of the other kinds of data that many of us collect and how they relate to those. But also, as well, the kinds of things that are routinely put up on sites in various ways that are then accessible or not accessible, depending on what's being done. And so sort of the actions of federal government, the recording of those actions is itself a form of federal data that has import. There's also, I think, to some extent, sort of data that the federal government helps create that exists in certain ways elsewhere. I think maybe we'll talk somewhat about that, but it's also that to me seems like a sort of half relevant category right now, because the direct control of stuff is matters at the current moment. And the other thing is, I think, as we're dealing with data that exists in the federal government, the ability to sort of trace what's happening at any given moment and who can track that and what is another important form of federal data that we should be thinking about here.
Okay, thank you. Laura.
Sure. Data for me as a journalist is definitely, for me as a journalist, data is a tool that makes my storytelling stronger. It's one thing to have a compelling, anecdote, a strong interview, like you really feel like you know someone's story, but to tell that to an audience, to share with your audience why that story matters, data so often is the core of why they need to care, why our on our nightly broadcast, we want to take up 6 minutes of your life to tell you about how this community in Kentucky is doing when it comes to healthcare infrastructure, or how these students are doing in San Francisco, or, just to let you know why these stories matter. And again, to just basically to build off of what my colleagues have been saying, it's so much the core, the backbone of our understanding for research, for policy and policy making. And without data, what are you responding to? You're just responding to someone else's words oftentimes.
Justin.
I sort of +1 to everything that my colleagues have said. I get the enviable task of going last. Two things I would add. One is not just the data itself, but also the means of accessing this. And so the different portals, the different websites, the different ways that you're not just downloading a bunch of CSV files or things like that, that these are searchable and curated in some way, that those infrastructures are part of it too. And I think in addition to this, we are talking about data, but all of that data is in some way created by a human being. And so also thinking about the people responsible for creating these and the stories that can be told by journalists, but also that, there are effects when this data goes down on the folks who are creating it, and the fact that they may not be able to create any more of it due to the actions of this government.
So thank you for those answers and the sort of frame setting. Now, 4 of us who have spoken have alluded to something happening in the government that would bring us here today. One of our panelists, who can give us a 30-second summary of what's been happening to or around federal data in the last 100 days?
Interpretive dances, etc.
So a lot of data is disappearing and is being disappeared throughout the government. And this is a stark difference from the first Trump administration, where we were very worried about lots of different data going down and very little did in the grand scheme of things. And that is very, very different now. And so across the board, not just climate, environmental, like where we saw a lot of it focused the last time, but across education, social sciences data across the board, health data, things like that. And in some cases, data is going back up in a changed form as well. So that is sort of even more nefarious in some ways. So that is a very short course summary, and we could get into a lot of details about what was targeted and why. But a lot of material is going down across the entire federal sector.
And as we start to think about why this matters, does one of our panelists have an example of data that is either at risk or gone that can ground us in a discussion about a potential implication for this data loss? I think Laura probably does.
I mean, we've been seeing a lot of data disappear, as Justin was saying. Thank you. As Justin was saying, related to health, especially. I mean, there's PEPFAR data that has just been digitally shredded.
Can you explain for folks who don't know what PEPFAR is?
Oh, sorry. I mean, it's like USAID and has taken steps to try and help alleviate HIV and AIDS in the world, and it's just basically trying to gauge treatment and access to treatment and offer resources to affected communities. And so across different agencies. But this has also been targeted by the Trump administration because it's inconsistent with policy priorities that they see as relevant to the world order going forward. So, what this essentially does is, just attempt to erase a reality, but the people who those numbers were representing, like each one of those data points so often represent a human being, a life, and just erasing the data doesn't erase the life. That person is still there. Those people and communities are still there and still have needs. And when we're not counting those needs and those people, it becomes more difficult to address those problems as they persist. I mean, the way that I think about it is, you can have a measuring stick that can measure success or failure, can gauge success or failure. But it's if you break all the rulers, if you break all the measuring sticks, you're just taking someone's word for it moving forward, and you lose evidence and to push against claims of success from whoever happens to be in power.
The notion of evidence, Josh, I want to follow up on something you mentioned in your intro about federal data as used to understand. So now we've heard it as evidence for something happening. You talked about understanding. What are the implications for understanding that disappearing data have?
So federal data are really heavily used as a way to make sure that we can calibrate the things that we know in various different respects, and to make sure that we have some kind of sort of understanding of key topics that we may be interested in. When a bunch of the initial data sets went down, there was evidence that data on gender identity was being pulled out of some of those data sets. Once that data is gone, you can no longer calibrate against gender identity. You can't try to make sense of what a particular novel data collection says. When we go out and we collect data in society, most efforts at collecting data are fairly limited in their ability to get a full picture of society. It's very, very expensive to do something like a census, right? The 2010 census was what, $14 billion. I don't know what the 2020 number eventually was, but these are not cheap things to do. And the ability to use high quality, trustable data as a source of calibration for the stuff that we want to understand is really important. And when we don't get that, things start falling apart pretty quickly. And already, I've been looking regularly. I really need to use a regular current population survey data set that just hasn't shown up this year. The voting supplement that they usually put out following the election has not gone up past the date that it would have usually. This means I can't take a whole bunch of election polls I'm working with and figure out whether they're accurate or not in terms of whether they tell us about who voted, right? These kinds of questions become much more difficult if the data is not there to compare with. And we can't figure out if the data are being manipulated, if other things are happening, if we can't regularly check back and check across different data sets.
Catherine, what are we missing when we think about so we've had a couple of examples. When we think about all data recorded at taxpayer expense, what are we missing that we ought to be thinking about that has implications for society?
Well, I really worry about social media. I worry about real Donald Trump on X. I worry about Truth Social. I worry about I think maybe we could make a case that preserving what Elon Musk says is an important part of preserving like the work of the federal government. So things that are that fall outside of like official communication, but still have a lot of power to them. That I'm worried about that because we would not want to be in a situation like that happened in the past, actually, after January 6th, when Trump was kicked off of Twitter. It was just, there was no way to look at an official version of his tweets, right? And so if like official policies can be communicated that way, it seems like we should always be able to see what they are. So I worry about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Justin, looks like.
I would say, yeah, because I think with so much of a sort of revisionist history, forgetting, memory holing, if we can't point to something and say, look, you actually said that, we have the receipts. Like, oh, I didn't say that. That becomes very difficult. But I also wanted to add a sort of forward-looking dimension to this, and something that just dropped yesterday, which was that all the authors of the National Climate Assessment were essentially fired. And so this is the preeminent climate change study and work in the United States. And, you know, there is not going to be the mechanism for this very important information, you know, writ large, including data, to be able to gather that, which will have incredible impacts in terms of not just how we understand the, you know, very unevenly distributed aspects and effects of climate change, but also being able to get funding and prepare for those effects in places that have already been devastated by climate change in this country. So, and that's just, again, one, when you asked that question, Libby, I was like, where do we start? Because it could be just like throw a dart at a sector, and that's happening now.
Right? We could start, it's 12/22. We could start listing data sets that are disappearing and that matter, and we would not be done at 1:30 when we're supposed to end. And we probably wouldn't even have that many duplicates. Like, we could just keep going. So now you've both mentioned, the last two speakers both mentioned these sort of things that are outside official data sets. And Josh, you also mentioned the sort of data that exists elsewhere, but is maybe related to federal. Can you talk a little bit about what's in that gray area that you wanted to come back to, that we maybe are not thinking of as like what's listed on a government website that doesn't exist, or that was an official communication on an unofficial channel, whether it's, say, Signal or Twitter or Truth?
Well, yeah, I mean, just take the Signal chat, right? Like we all know this example, so let's go at it, right? Making U.S. policy via Signal. You may even think that it's like okay in some respects to have that kind of chat fine. Like, but what is the record of that? What does that mean for our ability to make sense in the future with how decisions were made, with what they meant, to be able to revisit stuff, right? We have, all sorts of understandings in a democracy that, there should be abilities to check for various different actors to check on other actors. They can't do so if the chats no longer exist and have, a 3-day deletion time or whatever it is. We expect that there, should be an ability in the distant future for this stuff to get publicly released, but it can't get publicly released if we don't actually have those records being kept anywhere. So if the sort of day-to-day stuff that's being done isn't kept anywhere, if the ability to sort of see a picture of what actually appeared in a particular place at a particular time isn't being kept, if the information about, who in the military is, has had accomplishments that's a minority person has been pulled off of the website and there's not actually a record of that somewhere, that no longer is sort of part of the story in any respect. Like gets very difficult to document very quickly. And so external actors can start trying to do that documentation, but it is much, much harder and in some cases impossible.
Justin, Laura, did you have?
No, I mean,
Nope. Go ahead.
Yeah. I co-signed to everything Josh said, but also too, it puts the public at a greater distance from the decisions that are ultimately going to be dictating the terms of like day-to-day life for so many people and it's just, it's putting them at, and the rest of us at a greater disadvantage beyond just journalists telling stories. Yeah.
Justin, you have some experience with the 2016 Trump administration, and this one had mentioned this is different. What's different this time that matters?
The scale and the coordination.
Tell us more about.
So, we were trying to figure out what might be most at risk, and we knew the EPA climate change page came down on Inauguration Day. But a lot of that, like I said, because there was both sort of lack of coordination on the administration's part and lack of centralization in terms of federal data. You can't just flip a switch and say federal data goes away, thankfully. And it took, 8 years of coordinated efforts to figure out where to target this. And so we also knew that there were a lot of things that were more clearly at risk in websites, in other kinds of federal information. And we were tracking, down to the character on website changes within EDGI and being able to show when things got pulled down, when things got put back up. And there was a thing where I was working on the National Park Service site and a bunch of their climate change reports came down and we're like, hey, what's going on? And it was like, oh, we're making them more accessible. It was like screen reader accessible in terms of PDFs. Like, okay. And then they came up and they actually were more accessible. Like, okay, cool. But give us a heads up in this moment. And so just that way of, it's just like everything else. There's such a fire hose right now of actions across the board in so much more of a coordinated way that the scale is much deeper and wider. I don't know what the correct term.
All the dimensions. Of
everything ever all at once. And being able to respond to that is a real challenge because we still are faced with the same kinds of questions we were faced with in 2016, 2017, 2018, which is what is the most valuable? What is the most priority amidst all of this happening? And how do we determine that both, individual institutions, federal groups, federal employees, academics, community researchers, all of these, that it is where a lot of these conversations get sort of not stuck, but become much more challenging because we have so much that we could be doing.
Could I add to that, Libby? Yeah. So in addition to everything that Justin said, another difference is Doge and like laying off all the people who would be there to to preserve or to create data. And I think attacking the National Archives and Records Administration and like firing the archivist, those are other big changes. Yeah.
And just in case folks don't know, who is currently the archivist?
Marco Rubio.
Because deep archival expertise. let's turn hopeful for just a second. What are things that we could do? So as Justin mentioned, there isn't just an off switch for federal data. What are steps that could be taken, or sort of, we may need to articulate some of the vulnerabilities and then like sort of how do you address them? But when there's an effort or many efforts, coordinated efforts to remove data, whether federal or otherwise, what are some of the vulnerabilities that exist and sort of how do we address them as librarians and journalists and archivists and researchers? What are things that we can do?
How long do you got? I mean, I think,
An hour and 2 minutes.
yeah. So this is also the problem writ large of digital preservation. And that we could spend hours and hours talking about in knowing that all digital infrastructure is brittle at some point, and that it's, we don't know if this is the official copy of record of something, that it gets passed around and used among different researchers. And so one of the things that we had talked about and continues to be talked about is some sort of centralization, whether that's, through data.gov or other portals, but that also makes it easier to turn off and focus on. And so the decentralization actually really helped in first go round of this. And so then it becomes this, coordinated, but still, not necessarily haphazard, but a lot of people are like, I got to get all this data. So when I'm grabbing all these things, there are a lot of duplications of effort, but it's still really important. And then people talk to you and say, okay, I got this one, you get this one, I'll get this one, you get this one. And then, but then even then it's, something that EDGI has done, environmental data governance. Squirrel away.
Kyle has more. Yep. Well, it was at the very end of his answer.
I'm not sure where it popped out. There we go. So, yeah, the sort of not haphazard, but coordinated and things, and decentralization working in some ways, but also making it difficult to coordinate responses. I can't remember where I stopped, so I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. Okay. What else can address vulnerabilities? We have this tension between centralization and decentralization. I'm sure we've all tried to coordinate before, and we know that that brings its own set of challenges. What else?
Well, I would say for researchers out there, think about what data you're going to need. Make sure all the grant information you have saved a copy of. Data you work with, you can make sure that that is preserved somewhere. Make sure it's in Data Lumos or somewhere else. And there are different tools you could use for archiving web pages if you rely on those. Like you can use the Wayback Machine Safe Page Now. You can use Web Recorder. There's another one called PermaCC that will mint a DOI with a web page that you save, so that you can use that in citation. So you can just think a lot about what would, if what I use disappeared tomorrow, what would I do, and try to save it now.
The theme you're hearing is go talk to your librarians. Because this is something we do broadly around data management. And all of these things that are best practices around data management are helpful to this. And so it could be your own data and making sure this work that you've worked on doesn't get disappeared, but also the work that you're using. And as I've said to everyone I've talked to about this, if you are concerned about a thing, a data set, a website, or things like that, come talk to one of us and let us know, and we can try to get that in some way, shape, or form. Especially if we know that it's targeted.
I think there's another messy piece of this, though, which is thinking about how to validate what you're looking at going forward. And I don't know if we have that sort of built in. Maybe I'm jumping questions because I forget what was on the question sheet. But I think it's worth noting that there is, in many different research practices and attempts to understand data, an assumption about how one's current data should continue to relate to what what will be observed at later points in time. And I think this is a point that you want to think about. If there is a case where you have data that you're working with that is potentially subject to some attempts at manipulation in any way, shape, or form, there could be a reason for that. You want to think about how you would be able to actually identify that. What would be the features? What would tell you that something is off? Because, when you have a potential for playing with not just the presence of data, but its validity, its reliability, the systems that are used to generate it, it becomes really important to be able to identify anywhere that no longer holds up. So what are the trends that would tell you that? What would be your indicators? Those, I think, are a key piece of this story, because some data sets are not just disappearing, but changing. And identifying the changes is tough, especially if it's not a change as in we took this down and we put it up with a different thing, but that we altered how it's going to be collected and reported on moving forward to some other end. And that is not abnormal in, backsliding, systems that are moving away from democracy.
And I would just add one of the, to get into one of the technical pieces of it in sort of digital preservation land, we were using a tool called Bagit, which was developed by the Library of Congress, and it is a sort of authentication. It creates a unique hash for that data set. And we can tell if you open that or you find that someplace else, the hash is going to be different. And so being able to, and that is a gross oversimplification, so digital preservation folks don't come at me. But there are ways to tell that within these kinds of ways of archiving data. And so being able to understand that as part of your workflow, whether you are working with data or you are creating data, like that's another layer that I think we would talk about as part of our digital management, data management kind of thing, as well as more broadly, just sort of best practices now. I would say even more so with data getting hoovered by AI things as well. Be able to check when something has been hallucinated out of your data.
And I guess just to zoom out more broadly, for journalists to continue to share that this is happening, that these data are going away, that the way that we're, responding to problems in communities and across the country is at risk of changing in fundamental ways. And so that's the reason why it continues to matter and going forward.
Laura went right into my next question, which is about the media. So what is and what could be the media's role in awareness and reporting on issues about disappearing data?
I mean, I think, anyone, like a health reporter could talk about, these are the rates in X community in, 2023 for this particular illness, or these were the vaccination rates we saw last fall for COVID or flu. Data moving forward are unclear according to such and such expert in the field, like that kind of, like, just nodding to it, even if it I'm not saying that, everyone is going to be able to write on this all the time, because that's just not the reality of newsrooms, but nodding to it where we can, when we can, is it. I think that just to continually beat that drum. It's important because it's not going away. And the after effects are going to be like as Josh was saying, like, how are we measuring things going forward? It's one thing to save what we already had at one point, but how are we going to say, going forward in this administration and years on down the road, like whether things improved or declined, and by what, and or stayed the same, and through what means. So just to the degree that journalists can, to stay on that.
I was in a conversation yesterday where something came up about this analogy is going to seem off. Stay with me for just a second. We were talking about sports data, and that when the rules change, so say the introduction of a 3-point line, the data generation function changes, and you may not know that the underlying function changed and explains why did people start scoring so many points. Josh, are there data generation functions in the government that we should be watching out for that might make that kind of change that we also don't know about the generation function, even if the data still looks like it's available, but it's really not, it's not generated or captured in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is really the actual bigger risk, right? If you're missing a piece of data, you can kind of figure out like what's missing and why, and maybe you can't document the thing you want to document, which is a problem in all sorts of respects. But what scares me seriously is the potential to try to push the way that data gets collected in ways that's somewhat opaque. So I think the best recent example of this was the discussion a number of years back about whether the census should be limited to US citizens. The direct implication, should that change have been implemented, would be to massively shift where the apportionment would happen following a redistricting for Congress, right? And so the downstream implication of changing who gets counted or how people get counted, or even just trying to do the underlying work of scaring people away from getting counted, has a pretty direct subsequent implication that has to do with who's represented how well in Congress, where federal money flows to, and all sorts of other things. Those kinds of downstream implications are massive because federal government data sets get used for all of those kinds of assessments. Attempts to figure out what money gets distributed where are based on the data the federal government has on the people who qualify for X, however that might get produced. If there's a decision to say, undermine a particular governor whose state leans a particular way by doing something that will be more likely to undercount individuals in a category that would give them money in a particular state, that could result in changes in federal money being distributed and in sort of huge downstream implications. So there are ways to use data to pretty directly manipulate people, punish people, try to change elections, et cetera. That is very much a possibility, and it doesn't take much of a shift in how you do stuff to change that.
I think, as Kate mentioned, my involvement here started over one long weekend. That was because researchers who rely on the sexual orientation and gender identity questions in federal surveys knew that those questions were going away. And if, like you mentioned with PEPFAR data, that just because you stop asking the question doesn't mean those people disappear. And their needs don't disappear when you stop counting them. And this related to sort of where does public health money go for infectious diseases that are more likely to impact a community that's no longer counted? And what does that mean for those individual lives? So we heard a little bit about what is a most significant threat that Josh thinks is happening. Let's go back down this way. If you had to pick sort of like top 3 things that keep you up at night, and only 3 because we're time limited, but not because there are only 3.
Yeah, I heard you just say all the things. I mean, I think part of it, every time I think about one thing, I just think like, well, there's also this that is bad. I honestly, I think the climate assessment firings and the lack of NOAA data, like all of those things, because I think it was Margaret Atwood who said climate change is everything change, and that touches on and informs so much. And I would also put in the environmental justice offices being closed and all of that advocacy work that could happen in ways that aren't usually captured as part of climate change mitigation or adaptation efforts. Those are the things, because they have such far-reaching implications, both for people now in the near term and in the long term. But as soon as I say this, I want to caveat that, like, well, I don't think, this is more important, that we shouldn't focus on PEPFAR or all these other things as well. And that's the bind that we are put in by these efforts, that we have to choose what we can lose in some ways.
I mean, one of the problems, and there are many, I won't bore you with my anxieties, but like one of the things that really just sort of echoes across my thoughts these days are just during the COVID pandemic, we were talking about narrowing health disparities. There were real conversations about that and real efforts to try and make life, improve quality of life and health outcomes across multiple, like, different communities. And just thinking about how, again, like, just because we are no longer measuring those things or those data are gone doesn't mean that those needs go away. In fact, they're more likely to continue to deepen and worsen, and people and communities are going to be harmed as a result.
I would add, I'm worrying about education data a lot as the Department of Education shrinks. And recently they announced that the NAEP, the Nation's Report Card, is going to be smaller in the future. So we're just going to like know less about what our kids are doing in school and how that's going. I don't think that's good. Another kind of data that I would really worry about is the data that is restricted access. So that is not going to be covered in any of these like archiving programs. So if you are a researcher and you're working with restricted data, maybe you could just save it yourself since you're already accessing it.
So I love that you guys keep segueing into this conversation. So now I'm going to say, okay, what's one thing that people in this room or in Zoom can do to alleviate some of these? And Catherine gave us one, which is if you're working with restricted data, first double check your DUA, but maybe, you know, just like make sure that you can still access it for as long as possible. What would be another thing? I'm going to ask everybody too. So.
Okay, well, let's see. I mentioned Safe Page Now and Web Recorder and PermaCC. Call your congressperson. How about that? Demand an update to, you know, the laws that exist are from the before internet times, and they're probably due for an update. So yeah, maybe call your congressperson and demand legislation that ensures like permanent public access.
I mean, I think, you know, I think obviously trying to sort of make sure that whatever data you have access to that is, you know, useful for you in any way, shape, or form, you think about how to make sure that you can hold on to it. And you also think about sort of what other requests can ever be put on that data. We had this weird scenario a number of years ago, which maybe I should not admit, between Libby and I, where we were sort of dealing with what would happen or what was going on as Twitter was changing over to X and what would happen with any data that existed there. And it became clear that sort of there were potential calls that could be made on access to certain data at certain points in time and could require researchers under certain cases to delete that data. Are there ways to make sure that if you have access to anything like that, you can actually put it somewhere that would not be a concern, right? Are there ways that if you ended up having, if you have stuff that's public, that the government could make some kind of a claim against? Can you make sure that there are proper private copies of it that are separate, right? Whatever that set of circumstances may be, because I'm imagining at least a bunch of this audience is people who are working with data to varying degrees and have access to data that may be interesting and useful. And so I think the first thing is sort of figuring out, okay, how do I make sure that whatever I have is something that I can hold on to and can be secured regardless of what comes my way. And then second, I think, is building in that sort of set that I mentioned earlier, which is, can you think about ways for any data set that you're going to continue relying on in the future to come up with a regular validation strategy for it? Even if it's sort of ad hoc, can you identify if something real underlying is changing in a way that suggests that you are no longer dealing with the same continuous data stream you used to be? Because finding that when it occurs is not easy if you don't have the information to know the data generating process. And increasingly, as everyone relevant is getting fired, we don't really have the people who know what the data generating process for X necessarily is. And so any ability we have to sort of uncover changes in the data generating process, I think, are a big deal and one we should be looking out for regularly.
Yeah, sure.
What I would say, just, I mean, as a journalist, is, having, I would want to have versions of these conversations like all the time as well, just because what I know reporters don't want to amplify wrong information. And what I would also hate to see is people just not including data because they're afraid of what might be in there, or if some kind of zombie number is going to come back and get them later. Just like as those, I would love to stay in touch with all of you, but yeah, I mean, especially people who are working on these issues, just so that I know that I'm putting out the best information that we have at our hands possible.
So I'm going to talk about this in two ways. The first one is the sort of the technical side, what you can do. This is all very overwhelming to dive into this, especially if you haven't worked with a lot of data or thought about, things like digital preservation and Bagot and all of these other things. But I think what you can do is understand, the stakes of your own work, the stakes of the data you create, the data you use, and reach out to people who are experts in this to be able to talk to them about it. I think it's also being able to talk upwards to the people who may have more power than you in the institutions you're working in to say, hey, you should care about this and you should take a stand on it, and actually dedicate the resources to this on a wider scale. If we have expertise at this university, there are ways that we can support researchers. And I'm not just saying the library here because we can't help everybody. We would love to, but we can't. Give us more funding and let us hire more people. But being able to, support these kinds of efforts in the coordinated way. And the second part, the other part is more to what Laura said, is the storytelling and the advocacy around this. One of my favorite pieces, sort of series that have come out since the election is Sabrina Imbler over at Defector, where she is basically publishing interviews with fired scientists from various federal agencies. And getting these sort of very personal stories of people who are creating, working with this data and seeing the effects, both at the wider scale in terms of how this will affect the community's funding in many different ways, but also the stories of people who were creating and using this and responsible for this. These are the experts who, helped us get this data and use it and maintain it over the years.
Thank you. I'm gonna stay in this like sort of hopeful forward looking for a few more minutes. Can anybody talk about efforts that are currently underway to do preservation? I know Justin can, but if there are others, folks, I want to reserve time for them as well, and sort of who the key players are in those initiatives and what success or setbacks should we know about. Well,
You're starting with me? Okay.
yeah, we're gonna start with Justin, but I want the other three to know we're not end there.
So I know the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, and part of this sort of environmental data project is happening, but it's been a lot of, I'm on the Slack channel for the data rescue coordination here at ICPSR and folks around the country. And so, being able to connect, I see people added to that Slack channel all the time who are like, hey, how can I help? And so a lot of it is just, sort of reaching out and connecting with people who might be there, where someone who is a data librarian and can say, okay, well, they've probably heard about this, connect with them. Some of these are large scale, like the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine. There's efforts at Harvard that just like scraping the entirety of data.gov. And these are the wide scale efforts, but again, these sort of smaller scale efforts that are coordinated amongst institutions, but aren't working at the scale of data.gov and things like that. And so while I want people to be coordinated, also, I don't want that, like, feeling like you have to dive into something huge as a way to prevent you from reaching out and getting started with those efforts.
Yeah, I think but if I do this, I can't do this, or starting here shows me all these other data sets that are disappearing is one of the setbacks. That just like overwhelm and despair count as setbacks. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Who else has an effort that we should know about, a preservation effort or setback or success?
Well, I already mentioned Data Lumos, but that would be one. And Justin mentioned the Internet Archive, and specifically the end of term crawl is a coordinated effort every 4 years to do a crawl, and you can nominate sites to that if you are worried about a particular website.
I mean, the data rescue project is another one that comes to mind for sure. And they have volunteers signups. And so there's different ways of getting involved depending on your ability and time to commit.
I'll say when we were running these back in 2017, we often asked people to bring a laptop, but of course people didn't. So like, okay, you can help check things with someone who does have a laptop. And so being very, very inclusive for folks who, definitely wanted to help. And so figuring out ways that you can help, and folks who may not have this technical ability, if you're, someone is going to be recording oral histories with people who are helping this kind of work or talking about why this is important or talking to, protecting identities as needed, but like being able to document this from a storytelling perspective as well, that may not rise to a journalistic level, but could become, stories for that as well. So I think there's always, again, a broken record, but just that there is much more than just that technical work that we can get bogged down in terms of data preservation, data access, and things like that.
Can we talk a little bit about, I know we don't want to get bogged down in the technical work, but let's talk a little bit about what happens between the, oh God, it's going down, I need to save it, and it is preserved. What are some things in that space that people may not realize exist?
Well, depends on the size of the data set and the scale of it. Sometimes, if there is a website, we can save that to the Internet Archive in the Wayback Machine. It might not be the entire website because embedded media doesn't always get captured. That's why you have to look at other platforms for that. But, if it's here is a CSV file for something, we can download that, wrap it up in a digital preservation wrapper, and put it someplace else. And we know that is safe from being pulled down on that government website. That is not fully preserved, accessible in the way that it should be. But if it's a larger data set or a portal, then you're talking about, for lack of a better word, scraping that through legal means, sometimes, borderline means, depending on the website and what kind of terms of service they might have and things like that. But being able to download this entire portal as a way to preserve that, not just at like individual data set level where you're working from a repository or things like that. Or you're trying to gather all the PDFs that are located somewhere on this site that aren't nicely packaged into a data set. And so a lot of it is like downloading, putting it somewhere, and then the challenge is, will that website eventually come back up? Will that repository come back up where you got it from? Or do we need to think about putting it in some place that is, less brittle, Data Lumos, Internet Archive, things like that. So it's a lot of downloading and saving, and then, maintaining access in some way.
If I could just add to that building on what Justin said, like digital preservation is just a continuous effort. It's got to be like a lifelong commitment, because you're always going to have to, check on the bits that you have and migrate them when like the new formats come along. And so even something like the Internet Archive, like in the fall, they went down for a while, right, when they got attacked. So even the things that that we think of as like, well, this is the way to save it, are actually vulnerable. So, yeah.
But when this data is coming down tomorrow, like you get what you can, and then you sort of figure out that other stuff later. But there's always the conversation, well, now what? And what's the infrastructure we need to build? And people have been working on this for, like many administrations ago, working on this. And how do we, that is, those questions are even more intensified now.
When I want to echo what Justin said earlier about being inclusive in the sort of skills and opportunities that are provided during data rescue efforts, where there are lots of ways to be involved that are not downloading or not trying to capture or validate underlying data generation processes. That some of these are just websites where you enter a link and click a button. Some of them require you to save things. Some are about making phone calls. Like there are lots of different ways to be involved that can use lots of different skill sets.
There are browser plugins for the Wayback Machine. All you have to do is click the little column when you're on a website, and it will do its best to save that website. So that is one very simple thing that if you are worried about a particular site, install that plugin, click that, and you have gotten some aspect of that site. It probably won't be complete given the complexity of the site, but it's something.
Catherine mentioned that we could call our members of Congress to talk about data access and preservation legislation. Are there other legal pathways that we should be thinking about around protecting federal data?
I think there are some of these things, if these are, congressionally funded, that's something that has been coming up a lot, where it's like, hey, this actually isn't in your power to defund, delete, things like that. I think that is one way that people have been approaching this. I think it's also going to be, that sort of future efforts and say like this, you can't actually make these changes, and lawsuits around that. But again, if I think it would depend on how you conceive of this data and this information sort of fitting in the overall structure and work of a given agency, department, and where that fits in sort of the governmental structure would suggest different legal pathways.
Yeah, I'll just remind that, we hear a ton about executive orders and all these actions being taken right now, but it's kind of important to remember where the legal basis for this stuff is and isn't across the board when you're thinking about things. So when you hear about an executive order, what is an executive order? It is an interpretation by the president of a law. That's it. It is not a law. It does not have the force of law. It is an interpretation for how the government can act based on a law that already is on the books. And so if there is a law that actually says something specific about it, that law really supersedes anything that can be done with an executive order. An executive order is a marginal interpretation. That doesn't mean the marginal interpretations aren't consequential and don't have big impacts on how people in agencies for which it's being interpreted will interpret it. But because of that fact, right, stuff that is done on the kind of level we're talking about does not have the force of law. So, the question is, well, why is that data set being created? Is it being created because it is sort of core to the mission of the law or the agency that creates it? Or is it being created sort of as a functional thing out of some bureaucratic underpiece of that organization? If it's the latter, then changes in how that organization are run can potentially legally change what's accessible, though in many cases, because of laws around preservation and other things, and the federal government often can't actually get rid of the information legally, right? And so recognizing what the legal status of stuff is supposed to be, I think, is important in recognizing sort of when it's challengeable, when you can say, no, this is something we can and should go to the courts about because it can't actually be taken down or can't actually be made unavailable or can't be done in the way it's now being done.
Laura, I'm curious about what you think about the relationship between the legal pathways and the media and anyone who relies on the data, whether it's a researcher or a direct service organization or.
I mean, as far as being a journalist, I mean, my role is to basically let the public know that these things are happening and to ask why they're happening to people who are making those decisions, let the public know what the response is, but also too, I mean, I think again, just sort of beating that drum of like, where we can, like say like, this is what the data said about, COVID vaccine rates, like last go around. This is why we don't have a more up-to-date number. Like those kinds of those reminders are what we can do. But also hearing, when Congress is discussing these issues, like it's our job to also be sort of the record keepers for I think there's a like journalism is like the daily first draft of history. So to the degree that we can serve that. I think that's helpful.
We're just after 1 o'clock, so I want to give each panelist a time to say something that I answer a question that I should have asked you, but that I didn't. And then we're going to let folks ask, probably only in the room. I can't really get to you, Zoom, but we'll let folks ask a question so we can wrap on time. So I've been starting on the end. I'm going to start with Josh this time. So it's a question that answer a question I should have asked.
So I think there's a whole nother aspect to data that's worth thinking about, which is that data in all sorts of respects, and this is true both now and throughout history, is a form of power. Data allows for decisions to be made efficiently, and in so doing provides access to power for societies. And when data is not being made broadly available to people, that power is functionally being concentrated. It is not being eliminated. And I think in light of things like Doge and how they've gone through and by all accounts connected a whole bunch of forms of federal data to one another, while at the same time we're seeing elements of the government block off access to components of that data, whether because they're deleting them or whether because they're just making them no longer accessible. There is a functional capacity to do many things with the power of data in that environment. We don't know what the choices are and why that is being done to a full extent at this point. But we should all be very clear-eyed, I think, in the fact that, if internal actors can connect a whole bunch of data sources together, and external actors do not have the ability to observe those data sources or to understand what is being done, power can be wielded in ways that are completely and totally opaque. That, to me, I think is the other big piece of all of this. It's not just the data that we're not seeing anymore. It's how the data is being used within the federal government that is really quite fundamentally anti-democratic, and we should all be aware of it.
Who wants to follow that?
I mean, and just thinking of potential examples that echo of what Josh was just describing. I mean, we're hearing about personal health records, federal health data, and a host of different data sets being connected to try to answer like causes of autism, and so I mean, like that's just one example. I mean, what I keep thinking about when when we're talking about data and being left in the dark as the public is, I think of a moment during the COVID pandemic when I was talking to a biologist. It was like June 2020, and there were lots of questions about what was being done with testing data and the timeliness of that data, and how were we understanding like the virus spreading, and how healthy were communities. And one thing he told me was that the monster's in the room even before you turn the lights on. Like it's like whether we know what's going on or not in these communities, as Josh was saying, like that power can be wielded and data can be behind it, and it's a matter of motivation and making sure that this remains public.
Catherine, you want?
Oh,
I guess I would just say that I think it's important to understand this as a problem that's just going to continue on, and you can imagine, at the end of the Trump presidency, we should be just as worried about preserving all of the data that was created during that, and so I don't think about it as like saving the good data from the bad president. This is just going to always be a problem. Yeah.
I don't think I have anything I would have wanted to answer, just like iterating that this is both like a huge task that has a particularly politically motivated element to it now. So we are trying to save things from going away, but that, while at the same time, this parallel effort, especially with folks who are working with data, creating data, to understand and participate in that conversation around the broader infrastructure that's necessary. And that's something, that can happen at the same time as we are trying to rescue things that are going down. So that is both a short-term and a longer-term vision for things that people like are gathered in this room can work on, as well as the storytelling aspects of it, and not just focusing on the charts and graphs and spreadsheets and things, but also being able to tell the stories of that, of how it was created and how it's used.
Thank you. We don't have mics to walk around necessarily, but I
We
can
do.
also repeat. Okay. Okay, so Lynette gets to go first because she's.
This one is just more of a plea, and sort of the underlying reason that we did this. I think one of the many things that's interesting about this conversation for me is that, and we didn't say it directly, sort of highlighting the different workflows of the way researchers, archivists, and journalists work. And the way Josh was talking about, you need a certain data set from the 2010 census that allows you to model work that you're working on now that you'll release a year or more from now. And journalist workflow is what is on fire now. And the way we work together is in a sort of communication where we each understand those two things. And one of the things that is, I think, intentional about the chaos now is that it's disrupting the understanding we have about each other's workflow. And so the thing that then keeps me up at night is, okay, we all know like what's on fire now. You all know what you were working on now from 10 years ago. And it's sort of the mid-distance that keeps me awake. The thing that we're not able to focus on because of the fires now, that then a year from now, we're going to go to some story that we normally would do at that point and call the researcher we would normally call and realize that it's like nobody can say anything because the researcher's not there, the data's not there, all the systems have been broken. And so, my plea is as much as possible that we keep having interdisciplinary conversations. I thought the legal question was great. And I thought, oh, we should have had lawyers in the room because they're
busy.
staying up at night over a different, over a different set of things. And, what are the people in the Civil Rights Division doing right now? And like, what are the people over at C's worried about right now? And so as much as we can be in groups and talking to one another about these questions, Libby, that you asked today were so great, maybe it can help us ward off some of those things.
Thank you. I can share panel if you guys need.
Yeah,
Okay.
Got it unhooked. So
Okay. Are there other questions for our panelists? Henry's walking with a mic.
Thank you so much for this today. I'm Sarah. I'm a Knight Wallace Fellow as well. I'm curious, with all the disappearing data, have you noticed new data also being released and publicized by the administration? And how do we go about vetting the information or using it for future research? My work is in immigration, and I've noticed that the numbers that are coming out from DOJ, especially with Social Security and work permits, are being released in terms of publicizing. How do I go about using that? Or do I?
I mean, I think it's, I think it can be used, but it has to have caveats, right? I mean, you have to say like what the numbers were previously, what they are now, and at least nod to the changes that have been in place, just so that the public understands the context that these numbers are emerging from and what they were previously. I mean, that'd be what I would do. Yeah.
I think also to Josh's point that we used to have a little more information about the data generation processes. And so it's not that this is the first time we've ever had to make caveats, but that maybe the nature of the caveat is a little different, right? So we've always had a responsibility to acknowledge the limitations of our data and to explain where they came from. And now we just have a little less information about where they came from.
I'll add one more little thing to that, which is, there are also, again, there are ways to try to validate things, right? To see if you can get an extra number that you may not trust 100%, but that if that extra number sort of says this thing seems kind of reasonable, you feel better about putting that piece out on the table. right? About saying this, seems in ballpark. It seems to match up to other sources that we would expect it to, or not, right? As the case may be. And that, I think from a reporting perspective, that may be something that sort of needs to be part of the reporting, that you need to sort of clearly say, okay, we have this new data source. It claims to do X, based on a comparison with blank, seems like it might be lowballing it, but at least here's something that gives you a sense, right? That seems to be a better way to approach it than to just sort of take it as its word and say, well, here's this new thing, but
There's one up front. He's on his way. Play-by-play for Zoom. Okay.
If I may, just to dovetail on the comments that have just been made, how far ahead, if we go through an extended period of the elimination of data where researchers have to sort of be more predictive, let's say, than they have been, in the past, how long can we do that? Where we're saying, okay, we've got this year, these figures, these are accurate, but they haven't been for 4 years now. How long can we use the original, what we can trust, to what might be corrupted, and to be able to extrapolate from that? I mean, it puts on a burden to researchers that they have not had before. How long can we do that until maybe we get to the midterms?
So I don't think it's a completely novel.
Turnaround?
I don't think it's a completely novel burden. I think it's one we've actually faced in a variety of areas, but have not faced in certain other areas. So there are many kinds of data that we don't have reasonable benchmarks for, right? I work regularly with public attitude data. You can't get reasonable benchmarks for public attitudes. They don't exist, right? The only thing you can do is try to go out there and measure them as best you can and to see what they look like and how they compare to your prior measurements. So what do you do to validate them? Well, you take a series of different steps and you think about sort of how variable those things are likely to be over some period of time to the different steps you can take. So as an example, right, I'm right now supposed to be done and working in my office sort of constantly trying to finish up the pre-election polling report for 2024. How well did pre-election polling do this year, right? The reason we do that with polling is because it actually is like one of these very weird cases where we can try to validate attitudes at all, because we end up having an estimate of attitudes and then getting a number afterwards that gives us some sign of those, right? There are problems with the connection, but that's something that we sort of can do on a particular basis. But for most things, if I want to know what public attitudes are toward immigration, I just have to run a survey. That's all I can ever do, right? So how do I check that? Well, I start to say, well, first of all, are the other numbers I'm getting on my survey ones that match things I can believe, right? Am I getting the right kinds of numbers of other groups of people? Does the process that I'm using imply some level of validity for that? Am I matching what other different forms of data are getting? Can I use sort of a multi-trait, multi-method type approach to think about triangulating between different data sources and say, okay, well, if this is right as a set of assumptions, or if this is right as a set of assumptions, how much does that rejigger my sense of the value I'm interested in? And then you also can think about sort of variability in the quality of data set and variability of stuff over time as ways of thinking about it. So if you have the ability on an irregular basis to conduct an exceedingly high quality study of X, whatever X may be, you can then use the data that you've collected between those incredibly high quality studies to try to interpolate what trends might have been in the meantime. And you can use those attempts at interpolation of trends and how well things match up post sort of your old version of that interpolation versus the new high quality version to say, okay, this is about how much we think this approach to doing it is likely to vary from what we would get with the highest quality approaches we can use over time. And so if you take a bunch of those different kinds of approaches, you can get at things where you don't necessarily trust the underlying data. But the story at the end of the day is it's an empirical question, right? You need to know about your data how variable it could be under various circumstances, how at threat it is to underlying changes in other factors that may mean that something really doesn't hold now the way it used to. And the history of survey research is littered with that, right? Like in many ways, contemporary surveying began as a response to the Literary Digest debacle of 1936, when they interviewed 4 million readers of Literary Digest to come up with an estimate of who was going to win the election. But of course, they were very different from voters in the election because there were a lot of systematic features of who took those surveys. And so if you don't come to sort of dig into the data regularly enough to understand how that might work and take it from multiple angles, I think that's always a risk to some extent, but it's much harder when you don't have something that was that benchmark before that is now gone.
I think that I would answer that, sure, and we should probably have other data generating mechanisms. So we have been able to rely on federal statistics and federal data for lots of research and storytelling questions. And we probably shouldn't have been only relying on federal statistics and data to tell those stories and answer those questions. And this is an opportunity for data collectors, whether they're researchers or journalists or lay individuals, and people who fund them to provide support to make redundant data systems. And brittle infrastructure exposes opportunities for redundancy, and that is one place that this is happening right now. Did you guys want to say something? Or Henry's got another question, and then maybe.
I really enjoyed your response because I have a few little historical moments here. Real quick, the Library of Congress, which branch of the government does it belong to? It belongs to the legislative branch. They are terribly underfunded and understaffed. That means to do maintenance, create new products, et cetera, they are really strapped. That's point one. Point two, preservation microfiche of government documents. I called them once. Is this on preservation quality microfiche? Oh no, we don't want that because there's just too much information. The scale of reports coming in, it's voluminous. So what am I supposed to do with it? Well, you can just toss it out. Here are all these microfiche with all of these government reports. So we need to be alert to what is happening. And your comment about having more than one source to store is very, very valid. And here's a point to think about for the future. And of course, we heard about this, saving the data, how to validate the data that we have. And what is our point? The Galileo letter forgery. What did they find out? It was the paper maker's mark that discerned the forgery. So all of the package of the data, you have to look at the whole thing. So what am I saying? Publish. And publish open access. And even your previously published articles, make them open access. So there's more than one way to get to your great reports. Thank you.
Thank you. And then was it Trent? Were you next? Okay. And then Trent's up, Henry. Go ahead, David.
Well, I guess the folks in this row, we must be in cahoots because that was actually a great segue. 8 years ago, Catherine and Justin and I were in the same room talking about, it seems like we just kind of we missed a big one that, the data could have been completely gutted, but they weren't. And so we were in a discussion about how do we better preserve government data. We talked about the models of the Federal Depository Library System. We talked about lots of copies keep stuff safe. We talked about the rich history of ICPSR hosting the original public use micro data samples from the Census Bureau. And, we talked about the real need to have a more distributed system of storing and disseminating government data. And so I guess I have a two-part question. One is, did we do anything in the past 8 years to make that more distributed system? And the second question would be, with the optimistic assumption that we have data worth distributing from the federal government in the, near future. What's our opportunity to create those distributed systems? And I know that that would be a huge resource, it would take a lot of resources, but what would your vision for a distributed system be so that we can avoid oh crap moments?
So come up with an idea to solve the problem of federal data. Thanks. Thanks, David. Today, right, in less than 10 minutes. So yeah, I think there are people far smarter than me. I mean, I think there are a lot of these different elements. I think one of the things that I think one of the elements that does prevent us, and I think this is to your point of like the conversations across that aren't happening. Because one of the things that happened in 2016, 2017 was a lot of the people who were in this sort of nascent data rescue movement didn't really know about all the people who had spent their careers working on this. And so learning from them, but also recognizing that, there were still, lots and lots of gaps and that infrastructure was very brittle. And so I think it is much more of a cultural and a rather than a technical solution. We don't need to build a better box for this kind of stuff. And that's a much harder thing than just building a bigger box. So if I had to fix everything, I would try to break down the walls and the sort of assumptions about how people who know this about data want to use it and create it and have access to it versus how these folks want to use it and have access to it and things like that. So that's what I can say in like 2 minutes.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is just like you did something in the last 8 years, David. So that was good.
Yes. +1.
I think it's a real challenge to convince people higher up, administrators, to invest in like a long-term sustainable program. Because when times are good, the response is, but it's on the internet, And so it's just like it's a constant challenge for us to remind them that like this is very ephemeral and it feels very permanent right now, but it's really not. So I think we just have to keep working on that to try to create something that is more sustainable. Yeah.
Is this okay? I was just going to read a question from the chat that actually really dovetails nicely with all of this. This was Nicole Weber. It was actually 20 minutes ago, but it's what we've been talking about. Could this eventually someday be an impetus for better preservation of government data because we'll be less reliant on them to do it themselves, or is the volume and complexity too high? And I think that is looking 5 years ahead, that is the question of the moment. And I was one of those. I arrived at ICPSR in 2017, and Data Lumos was just getting going. The current president was the president at that time. And I was one of those who thought this is a good idea, but I just don't see it being necessary. And of course I was so wrong. It is. Everyone in this room can see that beyond the shadow of a doubt now, but something bigger is necessary. That's what's clear now, no matter who's in charge. So anyway, I was going to read that question 5 minutes ago, but we've sort of gotten there, I think. So thank you, Nicole Weber. One other kind of Pollyanna idea I've had that I've just abused myself of in the past 10 minutes is that a lot of the records that are being rescued now were never on record schedules. The government was never intending to be the permanent repository of those records. We just sort of trusted they would be, and that was mistaken. But a lot of them are on federal record schedules. And so I've thought well, we should demand that the government adheres to the rules it set for itself to archive these data permanently in the National Archives where they would be accessible. And I still believe that there's an angle there, but just to kind of test that myself, I went to the National Institutes of Health. All agencies publish their record schedules. You can go see them. So I went to look at theirs and the page has been removed where they exist. So perhaps that is not a foolproof plan. But anyway, thought I had. That's a statement more than a question.
So I really love that. And what I would say about the National Archives and Records Administration is that unless they are pushed, their definition of making it public would be like, well, you can come to College Park, Maryland and look at the printouts we made between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., right? So we have to really push NARA that we want them like online, easily accessible.
I mean, I'll just say just quickly on the can it all be, can we outsource it all? I mean, the answer is part of it can definitely be outsourced, right? There's a lot more that we could potentially imagine disaggregating in various ways, but some things can't, right? The census is not going to be disaggregatable, and it fundamentally needs to be, you know, a federal project in certain ways. And so I think that's another piece that we, you know, that clearly is part of it as well, right? So some things do have to be federal data sets because that is the nature of them, where other things may not. And also the rules around data collection make that different too, right? So federal agencies get response rates that we can't get in the private world, just for sure. We can't do it. Like, it is inconceivable in the present day and age to imagine a 30% response rate on a survey, let alone the 70 to 90% that you can get if you're, you know, if you're working out of the right governmental statistical agencies, right? Those kinds of compelling, you know, reasons for responding that are offered by government do improve the quality of the data in certain cases. And unfortunately, I don't know if those are recoverable from other efforts.
I'll just add one quick thing, that the importance of the federal level is, I mean, we're seeing the negative, the dark side of this, but it's at the federal level, you can say, you need to do this as a state. And so it is not just be like a la carte, like, oh, I'm going to choose to do this, but not this. Like, when there is a law passed around, you know, say the Civil Rights Act, these kinds of things need to happen everywhere. And so in that instance, it's not just a question of funding, but it's also the question of the weight of the federal government saying that states and cities and counties need to do this.
I'll be very quick, Libby, I promise.
Okay.
Sorry. So in 1 minute, I think it was Josh that mentioned, you know, kind of how broadly you were defining data, and also kind of what's, you know, being concerned about what's happening behind the scenes. I just want to leave you guys with a question that I've been really concerned about. It came up on a call with GAO a little while ago, where it's not just publicly, you know, research data sets, but actually one of the key data sets that they use from OPM in their audits, they've lost access to. And so I'm really concerned about, you know, what are kind of the regulatory and like oversight capabilities of, you know, the federal government? How are those being impacted? And you know, is there anything that we not in the federal government can do other than, you know, shine a light on that? But again, I'm not expecting an answer in like we're out of time. So yeah, but just wanted to leave you guys with that. Thanks.
OPM, Office of Personnel Management.
I mean, like, all I can do is shine that light. I mean, as a journalist, I mean, we can only, you know, gather these stories and share them with the public so that they know. Otherwise, just like the data, these stories go away and people don't know why they suddenly lost services to their community that they had maybe 3 years ago, or don't have, you know, suddenly they see their schools are, you know, suffering, like their patients in their communities are suffering. So, I mean, that's all I can do, and I'm here to do it. And I know my colleagues are as well. So thank you for the question.
So Lynette and I would both like to jump in quickly. I wanted to just thank everyone for coming today. I thought this was a really rich conversation. And one of the things I'm hoping for is guidance for sort of long-term kinds of responses. And as I alluded to earlier, we all relied on your social network connections in a grassroots effort to think about how to preserve these data. But let's think about how we might use this, right, to inform our structures so that we are prepared for long game. But I also want to just quickly thank Lynette, who came up with this idea over lunch and thinking about bringing us together. So I think it's been a terrific session. Thank you.
Well, came up with it because, so my other suggestion, always panic with a friend, that like there was this weekend where we're emailing, so are you freaking out? What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do about this? And then somebody answered, well, Libby's, you know, and then it was sort of this calming thing because Libby was creating a list. and it calmed everybody down for just a little bit. And yeah, if Libby disappears, we all need to come back into this room immediately. But I really thank everybody for showing up today. It is comforting. I think the comfort of numbers at a data panel is, we can say this, the comfort of numbers is great. And then this is stating the obvious, I know, but on the call your congressperson part, everybody loves a long form 50,000 word story or a 6-part podcast. The mundane part of journalism is being in the press corps, in the pool, admitted to the White House, asking the most basic questions about these things. And when journalists are barred from the White House and barred from the halls of Congress from being able to ask basic questions in our 3 branches of government, it disrupts all of this. And I think that's why that is a starting point. And so we just have to remember, to stand up for the unsexy parts of all of this work as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.